I have good news about Ares and bad news about Ares. The good news is I played him up to top 10. The bad news is I still don't know if he's even worth purchasing. Really weird card. Let's get into it. Ares is a 4/6 with an on-reveal ability that compares the power of the top 3 cards of your deck and your opponent's deck. If you have more power in those cards, Ares gets +6 power. This makes him effectively a 4/12, and it means that a lot of his synergies tend to be with stuff that care about having 10 power. This is a card that is very commonly going to be paired with stuff like Surtur, especially on day 1. I would expect to see a lot of that. What I've been wondering about is this card just good enough to run if you have another hook? We're going to talk about a bunch of different decks, but I actually had a lot of success just playing this card in Arishem as the third best 4-drop in the game behind Galacta and Doom 2099. And I've seen Ica, an excellent player who's definitely worth checking out, play it in Darkhawk using the rocks in order to make the Ares A, more reliable, and B, a bigger threat relative to what your opponent has if you restrict them in terms of rocks. The rest of what people are doing falls into, I think, a fairly underwhelming category, which is I don't think there's anything wrong with being a Surtur deck right now, but it does sort of lock you into basically having no answers to a discard deck going over the top of you, or a move bounce deck going over the top of you, or a Hela deck going over the top of you, or a Mr. Negative deck going over the top of you. I think at this point you can understand what the issue is with the Surtur versions of this. They're basically the same as they've always been. They have a lot of guys, but they don't have a high enough ceiling to compete with some of the very high ceiling decks in the game right now. I had the most success with this card by far just slapping it into Arishem. And that's not an endorsement, right? Like, I do think it is probably a pretty good 4-drop in the deck, but it's also just like, yeah, a lot of stuff can succeed in Arishem. That's going to be a very easy bar to clear. What it does bring in the context of Arishem is it's an excellent Iron Patriot follow-up, it's an excellent Iron Patriot anti-card, and it does give you some real ability to go tall very early into Iron Patriot that otherwise your 4-drops are unable to do. This is a real role, it's just a very minor one. And that is the thing that I think really sticks with me about this card. I don't think it is going to be able to fully revive the idea of Skaar Surtur archetypes. It's not impossible, but I think they have too many structural challenges in the form of the decks that go over the top. But it could just end up being a pretty good card in certain contexts, like with the rocks making it matter more. I don't know exactly the best way to explain this, but like the more rocks your opponent draws, the more 12 power just matters. Like, you can win games with less power when your opponent is drawing rocks, basically. And I think that's a reasonable use case for him. The Arishem stuff is a reasonable use case for him. But the stuff everyone is doing with him, I worry it will not have a long shelf life. Skada is basically a guy I look at as the resident Surtur one-trick. This is a guy who is high elo with basically one-tricking Surtur in much the same way as I typically have other people on who are there to provide specific perspective on specific decks. I do think that this is a person who probably has more reps of Surtur than many other people at the high end of Infinite. This is what he has been playing. The problem that I keep running into with decks like this is that you end up playing a game plan that has very few interactive tools for someone that's like seriously cheating. And what I mean by that is like, yes, you have a Cosmo, that's cool, but also you probably are getting run over by a 20 power Morbius if they're able to pull that off. You are in awkward situations fairly consistently against decks that are able to go vomit a million points of power. And I've talked so much over the last week about the importance of verticality in this meta. Surtur gets vertical very easily. Like, the verticality floor on this deck is high, but the verticality ceiling is low, relatively speaking. So the deck can perform well consistently, but it can't reach the heights of a Mr. Negative or a move bounce or a discard whatever it is that you're running into, this deck is usually going to be a little bit too mid-rangey in order to be able to beat it. It can beat other mid-range decks. Like, it's not that bad into most other mid-range decks. It's actually quite good into a lot of other mid-range decks because it can go above them. But the true, I guess, combo-y vertical decks of this meta will give you fits unless you can ruin what they're doing with either an armor, a la Arnim Zola, or a Cosmo. This Sauron list has been circulating mostly courtesy of a couple of my friends, basically. This has been a list put together by, I believe, Derek and EK Madi. This was an excellently positioned list in terms of if you're looking for something off the radar, this is a good enough deck to be good. It is quite powerful, but ultimately the takeaway is basically that Sauron is good enough, even when, at being an Iron Patriot deck, that you are just happy to use this skill set in the form of Iron Patriot alongside just a bunch of guys who play for a bunch of power. A buddy of mine named Prodigy ended up dropping the Typhoid Mary for Ares. I think that is a perfectly reasonable suggestion because Typhoid Mary really sucks downside-wise and does not have as much upside as Ares. Ares is going to be a better card than Typhoid Mary, even in the deck that is built to remove Sauron and get rid of that Typhoid Mary downside. I think Ares does end up being a little bit stronger. That's worth noting. Like, this is not nothing, that this card is taking slots away from cards that have more synergy with the deck, but I also think that this deck has the exact same problem. Every time I played against a discard deck or a move bounce deck with this deck, I said move bounce. This isn't bleach filler. This is not a deck that can keep up with that. It just is not. You are not going to be able to numbers them out of the game. They are going to be able to numbers you out of the game. You have absolutely no recourse. You have no recourse for, like, Mr. Negative. You have no recourse for bounce. You have no recourse for any of the decks that use move cards. You have no recourse for discard. And these are very popular decks right now. It's not a great spot to be in. I do think this list is cool and good and fun and unique, but it does have a very stark weakness to those cards. Here's the one that's going to get all the negative YouTube comments. The majority of my climb with this card was done with this list, and I think very reasonably you could tell me, hey, KM, don't mislead us here. Like, this is not a card that you need to play this deck. This is not a card that you need to feel amazing about getting, and you put it in Arishem, and it's going to break Arishem. Don't act like this card is good because you won games with it in Arishem. And I want to be clear, that is not what I'm trying to do here. I just do think that there is actually a niche for this card in Arishem, which is, right now there's a lot of Iron Patriot stuff. Having a card that is just big as hell and has the ability to just be 12 on an opposing Iron Patriot lane is great. Your other 4-drops are not as good at doing that. You have Doom 2099, you have Galacta. These are not cards that when you play them on turn 3 are going to win an Iron Patriot lane. Galacta can, but might not. And so you have this card as an option to absolutely flip that on its head. Outside of that, it is also a card that has just a bunch of stats on it. Worst case scenario, you played 6 power on turn 3. Best case scenario, you played 12. Galacta is like 15. Doom 2099, a little more than that. But 12 power is not bad. And I think that's worth pointing out too. I don't think this is necessarily always going to be a card that you want in Arishem. And I am also cognizant of the idea that right now, Arishem is very strongly a deck full of just like every Series 5 card to ever see print. That's not great either. But right now, it does provide an actual service here. It might not be the most important role, it might not be the most glamorous role, but it is a combination of being the 3rd largest 4-drop and being excellent into Iron Patriot and being excellent backing up Iron Patriot that, in my opinion, does make this card worth running. It's hard to justify purchasing this card based on an Arishem performance, however. I would argue this is one of the least important cards in this deck if you wanted to build this deck. You can cut it and replace it with any number of Series 3 cards like Juggernaut, and it will be perfectly fine. The farthest from being required. But it does actually fill a role here, and it's not just, oh, let's throw it in there and see what happens. There is some theory behind it beyond just, you know, Ajax sucks, or Ares sucks. I got my Greek gods confused. Ajax is a Greek hero, but close enough. Anyway, it's not just like, oh, Ares sucks, let's put him in Arishem so he'll suck less. There is a coherent thought process behind it, but also it kind of is Ares sucks, so let's put him in Arishem so he'll suck less. I got this list from Ica, and I think it's a really cute way of trying to make this card matter more. There are a couple of things that this deck is doing that are really cool right now. The first is that this deck is going to beat the crap out of Arishem. You hate Arishem, you can play this and you will win a lot of freaking games. The second thing that this deck does is be very good at disrupting your opponent in such a way as to make your big guys more valuable. When your opponent is drawing rocks, it is much, much harder for them to contest an Ares lane. When you think about how big Darkhawk usually is in this deck, it's not actually that much bigger than 12. Like, sometimes it is, but a lot of the time on the final turn of the game, he's not going to be all that much bigger. Like, it's about the same size. And if you think about it in terms of, this is a 4 energy Darkhawk, you are very, very happy to play this card. I think one of the things people, like, don't understand, I guess I would say, about these rock decks is just how often the disruption pays off and you never know, because they don't ever play the rocks, but they're sitting in their hand and they just like make a play that you're like, huh, that's weak and sucks. And then you win. And I think having a guy that is 12 power is really good in that context. You being able to use this disruption does matter. This is a deck that really encourages you to cope stay a lot, which means it's kind of my style of deck. And I like the overlaps here between the 3/1 drops and the Cull Obsidian. There is one note that I have that I haven't really fully figured out here, and it's that Absorbing Man feels like a little too cheeky. I get it, you have your 4/4 for the Zabu, like it just strikes me as like a little bit too cheeky, and my instinct would be to replace it with a Kate Bishop, which not only just generally excellent, but also additional synergy with Cull Obsidian. I think that would also be helpful in terms of the curve, making you have more 2-drops. I think this might actually be able to go somewhere. This is the first time I've looked at a Darkhawk deck and thought, oh, that's actually pretty interesting. And I think this one could legitimately have some potential to increase the fortunes, not just of Ares, but of the Darkhawk package as a whole. I don't think a lot of people expected this card to be a Darkhawk card, but once I see it, it makes a lot of sense. Disrupting your opponent means the 12 power matters more. Putting rocks in their deck means that you might be able to win that 12 power flip more, because rocks have 0 power. And that is really unique and really powerful. I have learned over a long period of time never to bet against Darkhawk. It just keeps coming back. And I have not seen a Darkhawk list that I've liked until looking at this list in about 3 months. Finally, I know there are going to be people who are trying this card in mill. Like, I get it, right? I understand the underlying logic here. Let me get rid of their deck, and then he's always a 4/12. Here's the thing, you play a 0/12. It's called Death, and it's better. This is making the deck worse. You are getting rid of stuff that is actively good in the deck in order to facilitate playing this stuff. Okay, sure, maybe you'll mill them. Congratulations on cutting cable, one of the ways in which you mill them. This is not good enough. Like, it's a classic thing that happens in Marvel Snap where people see a potential synergy and then build towards the synergy without ever stopping to ask, is this actually better than what I'm replacing? And that happens a lot, right? Like, one of the biggest insights I can provide you about Marvel Snap is when you only have 12 cards in the deck, if you play a card that is 10% worse than the next best option, you are giving up 1% of your win rate. If you play a card that is 50% worse than the next best option, you are giving up 4% of your win rate. Don't do this stuff. Like, you have to be, I know this sounds bad, you have to be cruel. You have to be ruthless. You have to make sure that when you swap cards in and out of these decks, you're making an upgrade. Because right now, I think that everyone playing Ares and Mill has taken a Mill deck and made it worse, and taken an Ares deck and found the worst one. And I just don't think it is a reasonable thing to do right now. I get it. It's cool. You can Grandmaster him to be 18 power. That's super sick. But you're giving up on the thing that made Mill good in this context of this metagame, is that it was the best Iron Patriot deck, and that it had a ton of awesome ways to win mid-range mirrors. And you're giving up these consistent plans in order to get an inconsistent one. And I just don't think it's what you actually want to be doing in the deck. You gotta be a little more ruthless than this. So verdict here is leaning no, basically. I think that Ares is an interesting and cool card, but leaning no pending how good the Darkhawk stuff ends up. If it is just a card that goes in Mill and makes it worse, and Surtur and doesn't make it good enough to be great, I don't think this card is going to end up being worth picking up. If this card ends up having a real home in Darkhawk, where it actually feels like it might be filling a real legitimate niche in the deck, that's when you start thinking about it. Obviously, there is an OTA on Thursday. I'm lucky, so I get to have that cop-out answer of, hey, wait till the OTA to figure it out. But I will be 100% honest here. My feelings on this card lean towards the negative right now. I'm not going to say that's a concrete thing. That's definitely true. That's always right. But I will say that right now it's striking me as like a little bit of like a 4 out of 10, a 6 out of 10. And one good deck might be able to make that number go way up. Like if that Darkhawk deck is good, there actually is no replacement for this guy, right? Like if that Darkhawk deck works, this guy is a reason why. I do think that there is something to be said for this card having more homes. One of the things that strikes me about day one with this card is a lot of people just did really obvious stuff with it. And I am part of a lot of people, right? I'm not going to sit here and act like I didn't do really obvious stuff too. But I do wonder, looking at that Darkhawk deck, if there are depths that are unplumbed about this card. And I do think that you might want to keep an open mind. That said, I would obviously wait, but I am leaning instinctively that I don't think this card is going to be worth picking up. It's not Bruce Banner, but the dynamic is similar unless it can break out into a different deck. If it can't make Surtur great, if it can't make Mill better, it probably doesn't have a lot of homes outside of stuff like Arishem, like I was doing. If it can make a deck actually better, a different deck that actually matches up well into the metagame, I think there's real possibility for this guy. Because fundamentally, what he is just great stats. Just a really, really, really big guy. And you do care about having a really, really, really big guy in plenty of decks. And he is going to be one of the biggest guys that there is at the 4-cost spot. But you have to find the right context for him. And right now, things are just too tall a lot of the time for you to want to play him. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for taking a look at this card with me. It has been an absolute pleasure. As always, I have been KM Best. You have been phenomenal. And let me know what you think in the comments. I still read all of them. Thanks so much. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.